Hey Dee, how are
Good
you?
morning. I'm doing all right. How are you?
Good, good. Can you hear me? Because I left my microphones upstairs. Are you good? Am I good?
I can hear you fine.
Okay, perfect. Good. Well, my iPhone 11 is still kicking. Happy Saturday.
Happy Saturday indeed. This is the earliest I've been up in 3 weeks.
Oh my gosh. No, I am all over the place right today. So I've got readings after this. I'm running out the door. So I actually had to like get up and make myself breakfast and lunch first and that good
I
stuff.
mean, it's coffee, green tea
Yeah.
latte, and I have the Fool's Journey basic tarot lesson to teach at the local metaphysical shop today, but that's not till 1, so probably take a nap in between.
Yeah, I'm down an hour more than you. So it's like I have to be there at 12 and it's 10 right now. So it's
Oh
like
crap.
button this up and zoom out of here. So yeah, I had to like step up everything beforehand so
Oh
I
my
can just
God.
zip out of here. But hey, you know what? That's life for us in October. So
Please, my God. Is it really only like what, the fifth? Is it really only it's only the
it's only
fifth? Okay.
the fifth. It's only the fifth, and we have solar flares coming in and beautiful stuff. Beautiful stuff.
I got my other major convention this month. And yeah, it's gonna be fun.
Yeah. That's awesome. So, Dee, I mean, there's not a lot of people out here that know exactly what you do and who you are. So, let's talk about it.
Oh my God. What to say? Raised in an Italian American household. Thanks mom and grandma,
Right.
because it was on my mom's side. My dad was an unofficial official Italian. He got adopted into the family. Raised in which means raised in Italian American folk tradition,
Yep.
which started me on my magical path early in life. I've been reading tarot cards since I was 11. Got my first deck as St. Nicholas left it for me in my shoe on St. Nicholas night when I was 11 years old. There's a whole story with that, but and then thanks to a couple other odd things happening in my life, a really early fascination with magic and magical history. And so I have been studying esoteric my entire life. In 2022, I came out with my first book, Burn a Black Candle, which is on all of my family's Italian American folk magical traditions. And in 2023, wrote a chapter about Italian American folk magic in Llewellyn's complete book of North American folklore. And now my second full book will be coming out spring of next year, and that is on wealth and finance magic. So
Very cool.
that's me in a nutshell. And I left off the decks.
Yeah,
Cre-
no, add them in because you have books for those too. We
um,
want to hear it all.
I created, what was that, in 23? I can't even remember the years anymore. My first deck is a Le Normand deck based on the art from uh, 15th century emblem books, and it's called the Emblemata Le Normand. There's a companion book called Secret Symbols that just help interpret it. And I'm working on my second Le Normand deck, which is called the Scrapbook Le Normand. And I'm about, as of yesterday, I'm at 50% complete with the art for that deck.
Congratulations. And I got a little bit of a sneak peek. And they're pretty cool.
Thank
They're pretty
you.
cool. I like them. I like that kind of um clip art scrapbook feel to them. They're really cool.
I very much like, I've for years, I don't do actual physical manual collage. And as digital collage has edged into becoming more and more realistic and, taking into account more cool ephemeral type stuff like ads and old wallpaper and just all kinds of bits and pieces, it's been really fun to be able to capture my vision without lots of glue and tape. So I'm pretty excited about it.
Yeah, no, it is really great. I mean, that is something that I really do like about the evolution of technology, that we have that ability to do stuff now, because I was never very artistic, but I had the idea in here and it was just getting it out and delivering it. And, now we can actually, use things like Photoshop and Canva and all sorts of stuff to, create what we're thinking, and AI, but we don't want to talk about that.
I still I worked in IT for 20 plus years, and I play around with AI, and I'm still like, I look at some of the art that supposedly it comes out of AI, and I'm like, wow, I don't know how they wrote their prompts, but they must be an amazing prompt writer because whew,
Yeah,
that is some serious art, some of it that comes out now, whether it's original art, that's the whole controversy, but
yeah. Yeah, I actually saw something earlier today that it was like a reel, and it was somebody walking on, like a model walking down the catwalk, and the elements were moving around each person.
oh wow.
And I was like,
Oh.
whoa. Like it was AI. They didn't say it was AI, but it was like, well, this was pretty apparent, but holy cow. But yeah, it almost makes you wonder, like, are you like do you have like a PhD in English to get these prompts right?
It's become a whole industry of its own, people
Yeah,
specializing in prompt writing and how to speak to large language models, because it's not really artificial intelligence yet, but that's what we call it.
yeah, yeah. It's gonna get interesting. It's just gonna keep getting more interesting. So I mean, this was like really cool. I didn't even think about it when we scheduled that, like, we are literally in the beginnings of Italian American Heritage Month. And I talked to Joanne from J Rose Apothecary on Monday, which was like the 30th. So we were like warming up into October, and now we have you today.
Happy to be
So
here, especially in
yeah,
October.
yeah. And so I'd love to like talk a little bit more about like burn a black candle and, growing up, because your experience so it's almost like every Italian family has a
Oh,
different experience,
yeah.
and there's different traditions and different forms of the Italian folklore that get passed down. And I kind of feel like some families get one aspect and other families get another aspect, and it's a big giant melting pot.
It really is. I mean, when you take into consideration that in Italy, the folk magic is incredibly regional, and it varies so much from individual region and town to town. And then you realize that particularly people who moved during the second Great Migration from Italy to the United States. The first Great Migration that happened was a lot of skilled workers and a lot of people their work was in high demand. The second Great Migration, which my family came over in, and most people's family came over in, were folks who didn't have anything. I, have done some of the genealogical research and I've looked it up online. And I had one uncle who he wasn't allowed into the country because he didn't have the prerequisite $5 in his
Mm-hmm.
possession, and he had to have another family member come bail him out and vouch for him financially. So, they came to this country, of course, seeking the great American dream. And then they were all thrown together. And all of those regional practices started to mix and blend and become what we call Italian American magic
Yeah,
today.
yeah,
And so, yeah, every family, contributed a little bit to the recipe of kind of the generalized practices we use today.
yeah. Very true. Very true. Because I mean, we were talking, Joanne and I, we were saying, like, my grandmother was more about like the dream divination. My great grandmothers are more of like healers. And but then there's other families, like when I started diving into this, there's a lot of other families, like your family, from according to your book, does a lot of work with saints. Like, I've
Oh,
noticed that.
yes. Yeah,
Hmm.
a lot of mom would never call it a family altar, but a lot of work centered around the family altar and with saints.
Yeah. And then there's other families that like were very into the divination part of it with the cards and, all of that stuff. So it's really interesting because you're not really, um, it's not like you could write one book on it and be like, this is what everybody did, you
No,
know?
it's not. And it made writing the book difficult. At least so the original idea for the book
Hmm.
was that I was going to write maybe a 50 to 100 page chapbook style, you know, probably hand produced, you know, maybe make 50 copies of it book about my family's practices. First, because I thought it was such a niche topic that I wasn't
Hmm.
sure if the world at large would be interested, but also because the primary impetus for writing the book was for putting down our practices for my daughter.
Right.
So my daughter knew my grandmother, but only for about the first 4 years of her life. You know, my mom, I'm still lucky enough, is alive. She's in her mid to late 80s now. So, you know, I wanted to capture some of these things because I understood that my daughter would not have the upbringing that I had, where I saw my grandparents every day.
Right.
You know, they helped raise me just as much as my parents did, and my mom and grandma were always there, and they incorporated a lot of their what I call magical practices, but they wouldn't call magic, but they incorporated a lot of those practices into daily household maintenance. So, like, the house chores were infused with all of these different practices that um, we might want to call magical, but they would just consider maintaining everything, the health, well-being, and happiness and luck of the household and the people in it. um, so I wanted to capture all that and put it into book form. And when it turned out that, well, the book was going to be published for a wider audience and expanded upon, you know, I happily expanded it and added more information to it. But then when I was writing the introduction, I was like, how do I approach this? Because one half of my audience is going to be picking up this book with no background in Italian American magic. They're going to be the witches, magicians, esotericists who are just interested in the topic. And then the other part of my audience is the people who are born Italian American and maybe saw some things, maybe saw and experienced and learned a lot of things that their family were doing, and they want more information. They want to see how another family does it, or they want to see, you know, maybe mom and grandma never explained themselves, because Lord knows I had to harass my mother and grandmother for information. It wasn't until I was in my 30s that I got
Yeah. I
all the
mean, it
information.
is hard enough getting a recipe out of them, let alone this.
But, you know, so I made it a point to address that in the opening of the book and say, my Italian American magic is not going to be your Italian American magic if you grew up with it, and your magic, probably if you have an Italian American neighbor, is not going to be their magic, because of what you brought up earlier. The differentiation between the practices, you know, from family to family is huge, which makes it fascinating to talk to other practitioners,
Yeah.
because you get to learn all kinds of cool stuff.
Yeah. I mean, and I had a very big disconnect, and we talked about that when I was on with Joanne earlier in the week. Whereas, like, my grandmother had a brain aneurysm when I was
Oh
9,
my
so I had that where I
gosh.
would see her every day and everything, and I was very close with her, and we did a lot of stuff. So I see and remembered some things, but once that happened, the whole connection fell apart. And my mother really was not. My mother kind of poo-pooed the whole thing. So I am literally constructing. It's almost like I'm constructing my own form of it with what aligns with me.
There are a lot of current day practitioners who are in the exact same position. I admire them so much because it's a lot of work.
Hmm.
You know, it's complex, it's difficult, it's a lot of trial and error. And you know, I joke around about how my mother and grandmother didn't want to tell me anything. I had to harass them. You know, recent immigrants, they want their kids to have a better life. And so a lot of times they repress and suppress a lot of these old-fashioned practices. You
Yes.
know, I wasn't taught Italian growing up.
Nope.
I was in an Italian speaking kind of household. My grandparents both spoke it fluently. My mom half spoke it. And then my brother and I, our generation comes along, and you know, I can curse really good in Italian, and I could insult in Italian really well. Amazingly, that made it through.
Right.
But when it comes to speaking it, it's a very rough for me. I keep telling myself I probably should learn. But I mean, I try to relax about that and go, well, this is authentic to my family's immigrant Italian American experience where
Yeah. I mean, and
Italian
even
wasn't taught.
right. And it wasn't, and that was the suppression that occurred in the 50s because my grandparents spoke it. They spoke it to their friends, they spoke it to their brothers and sisters, but they never taught my parents because it was one of those things, you're in America now and you have to like learn English and speak English. And then I actually, the only way I learned it was I got to high school and I was just like, I'm taking Italian, and I just I dove in. I mean, I'm not that great, but I can, stand my ground if I had to.
But
But yeah,
oh, I was
oh,
just going to
you're
say,
freezing.
I tried in high school to petition to get an Italian teacher, and I got stuck learning French.
Yeah, no, we actually had an Italian teacher.
Nice.
He was really great. And he was actually Sicilian, so it was really interesting because we were learning, he was teaching us his traditions through the Italian class. So like I even kind of got a little bit of like, Sicilian tradition history too, which is kind of neat.
That's really cool. I mean, and
Hmm.
that's the thing too that I did not know when I was petitioning in high school for an Italian class. My family didn't even speak Italian. They spoke Neapolitan.
Yes.
And so I would have my grandfather learned my grandmother's dialect so that they could talk together when they were younger, when he was courting her, because they spoke such different varieties that there was some difficulty in communicating at first. And so grandma has this very romantic story about how, oh, your grandfather, he learned my language so that he could take me out on dates.
Oh, that's sweet.
Really
But
great.
yeah, and that was the
Yes.
same thing with my grandparents spoke Neapolitan as well. But my grandfather was, I believe, part Barese.
Mm,
So yeah, so he probably did learn my grandmother's dialect as well. My great grandfather spoke what my grandmother refers to as high class, which was the Tuscan dialect.
that's what my
Because
grandpa spoke.
yes, because he was in Italy, he was a carabinieri before he came to America. So he had, he had to speak that echelon to like that universal language, apparently. So that's what he spoke. But then my grandmother knew Neapolitan. My grandfather would understand, but not, but answer my grandmother in English. It was just really funny to watch them talk. um, and that was, I mean, that's the story I even have about how I was taking Italian and she turned to me, she's, you're learning high class. And she'd start to try to speak to me. And I'm like, why are you speaking Spanish to me? Because I had taken like Spanish in middle school. And oh, she got so mad. And she's like, I'm not speaking Spanish. I was like, well, yeah, you are. Those are Spanish words. And when I finally went to Italy and we went to Naples, I was just, and you learn the history of it. Like, I didn't really like delve into it where it was like, oh my God, Naples was occupied for over 400 years by the Spaniards. So of course their language was going to get inserted into their dialect. I
Man,
mean, it was
Southern
just,
Italy was just like a revolving door of people coming
yeah,
in and occupying that part of the
yeah,
peninsula.
yeah, yeah. So,
Which makes for a fascinating culture with a lot of different threads to follow when you are doing that kind of reconstruction, and you're trying to rebuild your family practice. There's a lot of roads to go down that people wouldn't
oh
expect or
yeah.
anticipate.
Oh yeah. I mean, and even the fact of like, when I did my DNA ancestry and it came back and I'm like, whoa, like it was just, my mom was always like swearing up and down, you're 100% Italian, your dad's like half German. And I was like, yeah, well, no German came through. I didn't get any German, but 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 the interesting thing that I found in it was that Punjabi came up, and we've talked about this, but the fact that Punjabi came up in the bloodline. And I did not realize or trace back and figure out, because my grandmother was very, very like olive skin, dark jet black hair, like, and as soon as I saw that, I was like, oh my gosh, this is my grandmother's side of the family. And my mother's sitting there cursing me. And I'm like, no, there's something here. And luckily, I did a DNA, I did a CRI genetics, and it was really cool because what they did was if there was like a blip in like the alignment of the line, they would go to it and look at it. So with mine, they went back 75 generations, and with my daughters, they went back like 93,
Awesome.
which was like phenomenal. Yeah. And they saw the Punjabi, and it was like my grandmother's great grandmother. It was 6 generations back from me. So I was like counting. And like, you know, when we calculate it and we look, it's like, well, the Romani people, the Romani culture came from Punjabi because they were actually thrown out of their lands. And that's who the Romani were. And then they went all across Europe and everything. And some of them settled in Italy. And that's, you know,
That's
the
really
mix
awesome.
in with the culture. Yeah. Yeah. And
Yeah,
then
when
it was like, I was really starting to like put two and two together, because like when we were talking earlier, like I said that my grandmother, the thing that I remember the most is like the code for the dream divination. And I was talking to somebody and they're like, that's not Italian divination. And I was like, what? They're like, that's not Italian dream divination. That's Romani. That's Gypsy. And then
that's
everything
interesting.
started going together.
That's cool.
Yeah.
That is
Yeah.
really cool. Yeah, I
Yeah.
think I find the whole DNA testing fascinating. My mom bought my brother and I DNA tests for Christmas one year, and of course she was 100% Italian, but it was interesting as our tests have aged and they get more information and they change your results.
Yes.
The last time I went in there, I'm like 27% Greek. Like,
Yes.
awesome. Like, where
Yes.
did that come? Like, a smattering of North African. Yeah, things are starting to get really interesting.
Yeah.
Um, I find it interesting as they gather more information and they start to collate that data, your results start to shift a little bit
They
and
do.
change. And I'm
Yeah.
noticing more and more variation as they refine their data set. And I'm like, oh my God, what's going to happen when I open it up next year? What kind of
Yeah.
fascinating thing am I going to
Yeah.
find?
Because at one, it is interesting because at one point it said I was 7% Jewish.
Oh, nice.
And I was like, okay, well, maybe that was what
L'chaim.
my father thought was the German. They were actually
Mm.
Jewish. And then all of a sudden I went in and it disappeared. And I was like, where did it go? But yeah, I have some Greek too as well.
That's I have like 1% Welsh, and I have this fascination with Welsh folklore. I always have. Thanks, the Dark is Rising children's book series from when I was a kid. But I saw that and I was like, it is destined. I must learn more
Yeah.
about Welsh and Welsh magic. And my partner's like, will you please knock it off? Calm down. It's 1%. You've got enough to deal with. Like,
Yeah, I
true.
have like Finnish or something like that, but I have a lot of Iberian as well. And the interesting part was when I went to Portugal, I'm sitting here and I'm like, I feel like I'm in Italy. Like the food was the same, but just with a different name. And I was like, I could totally see how Iberian and Italy could lock in and be
Yeah.
seamless. It was so
Yeah.
interesting.
It's
And like,
such a mixture, and that's when people are like, "What's that?" You either are or you aren't, or you're this, and like reality does not work that way. Heritage and lineage does not work that way. I mean, if I had been adopted into my family, if I had not been physically born into my family but adopted, I would have still been raised the same way. I still would have learned the same practices. Just because I was a different bloodline wouldn't mean that I hadn't learned the exact same things that I learned because my mom gave birth to me. So, it's interesting to me. Sometimes the people I think are weirded out by ambiguity. They don't like the things that are in between, that are interstitial or liminal. And so they definitely want a one or another. You're either Italian or you're not Italian, or you're either this or that. And it's just not how the real world works.
Right. But I think that there's something there within the culture because we were like, as our home country, Italy, not America. The fact that I'm referring to it as it, were conquered so many times over that when they finally became a country,
Yeah.
I think that message got ingrained, you know?
Well, it had to almost be
Yeah,
forcibly ingrained
right.
almost, because that wasn't very long ago.
No,
The Italian peninsula was just a peninsula for the longest time. It wasn't until very, very recently that it was unified and became one
yeah,
country. And
like literally less than
yeah,
200 years, you know? Yeah, like 1856, 1876.
something
So
along
yeah,
those. It's in my book.
yeah,
I wrote down the
yeah,
date and completely forgot it, but went, wow, that's
yeah,
recent.
yeah,
Like, I'm used to thinking of the United States as a young country because it is, but who knew that an area in Europe would be, that country would be so new. I'd always expected it to be super old, but in the
mm-hmm.
history, of course, is super old, just like the history here is super old. But yeah, that idea of being one culture, which they're not. It's still not really one culture. It's still very regional, but
Yeah.
it's a relatively new idea. And my dog is freaking out, and I'm gonna have to go let him in, even though this is alive, because everybody else is asleep. I can
Go
I can
ahead.
still hear you. And if this little jerk doesn't come in immediately, oh, here he is. Good boy, Vinny. I am so sorry, but we're a nighttime family. Like we all have really weird circadian rhythms, and we're up super late, and so everybody's asleep. Nobody to help.
That feels very familiar. Don't worry about it. My kids are on that late night circadian rhythm, and I'm like 9:30. I'm like, good night.
Oh wow. And that's I don't know. We've talked on video chat multiple times. I have all new furniture behind me, and that is because that's my grandmother's sideboard and dry sink from her dining room suite. Her dining room table and chairs are in my library now as my library tables and chairs. And that's
Wow.
when my mother moved out of her house to a smaller location. My brother put everything in, a bunch of stuff in storage, and he's in North Carolina. And he called me and he's like, well, little sister, I'm coming. We're gonna go through the storage unit, meet you there. I'm leaving North Carolina at 6 a.m. I'll be there by 1 o'clock. He got to Louisville before me, and I'm only an hour or 2 hours, an hour
Wow.
and a half, 2 hours away from because I couldn't wake up.
Oh my
So
gosh.
I did manage to get
So do
furniture,
you
but
so my question is, are you feeling like more of your family's presence because you have the furniture now?
I am overwhelmed by memories. So like this little cabinet over here used to have a huge jar of these peppermints that my grandmother loved. And when I was a kid, she'd send me there to open up the peppermint jar and get peppermints and stuff like that. Um, and like the stuff that my grandmother kept on her sideboard, like remembering all of the china and stuff. There's a credenza that goes on top of it that I have not put on top of that because it would completely overwhelm my little office. So remembering that and all the things that were out on display, things that, her silver tea service and some of her other stuff, I'm kind of overwhelmed with the memories. My family's presence could not get more intense than it has been
Well, that was
for
my
years.
curiosity, that I wondered if having some of the physical stuff like shifted the energy a little bit.
No, but like I might be a special case. So, you know, because of my family's practices, when I set up my first household, I wanted it my kitchen to be like mom's kitchen. So my kitchen ended up with a little statue of Mary and statue of deceased relatives. And I didn't really even have names for it yet because I hadn't really thought much objectively about my family's spiritual practices. So ever since I moved out of my mother's house, I've had an ancestor altar in my house and have been talking to and working with my ancestors. And it's funny because the day we brought the furniture into the house, my partner, who's not Italian, is like, your family's is overwhelming. He's like, and most of them aren't even alive. He's like, we don't deal with them on a day-to-day basis, but the history and the stories are there. He's like, there is always a story. There's always a remember when. There's always your grandfather, your grandmother, your great grandfather, your great aunt, your great uncle used to do X, Y, and Z, you know, as I'm talking to my daughter, because I want my daughter to know,
Right.
you know, not only what it was like for me growing up, but that she has this lineage and she has these ancestors behind her. Um, so I think my office feels more peaceful to me now that I've got some of grandma's furniture in it, but I almost think it's kind of psychological. Well, one is it made me get more organized, so I have a much tidier office. But the other is I think that um yeah, yeah, it kind of at least brings me a feeling of peace. And I don't know if that's psychological or what, because my family doesn't usually bring peace. They're pretty intense.
Well, you know what? It's if you think about it, it's a big piece of furniture and it's wood.
And
So
it's
it's very
heavy.
calming and
Yeah.
grounding.
Yes. Which I could use.
Right.
I'm always like floating towards the ceiling. So, you know, I can use. But I find it very interesting. My father passed away 6 years ago. He is not Italian. He is the family member that communicates with me most often. And I think sometimes he does it to make up, to kind of balance things out a little bit, because there's so many people on my mother's side that I feel like I am in contact with nearly constantly. Dad comes in really frequently though, individually. He's trying.
That's awesome. That's fun. I definitely enjoy that connection with you know, my deceased relatives. I think it's really something you know, where it's my personal relationship, and I feel like it's so strange that I'm actually probably closer to them now
Mm.
that they're on the other side, because you can be like, hey, and they're like right there, you know.
Yeah. Yeah, I've had, well, the publication of Burn a Black Candle was haunted by my father. I'm telling people now, that's the term I'm using. My whole family, but he in particular fostered a great love of reading in me. And since I was about 6 or 7, he's like, write a book, kid, write a book. You got to write a book one day. Just write it. I don't care what it's about. I don't care if it's fiction, nonfiction. I don't care what genre it is. Just write a book. And when things started to really heat up with Burn a Black Candle, every single thing from signing the contract to everything all hovered around his birthday, which is October 16th. Um, and so a lot of significant events with the book happened. And I really felt like I was being guided by him the entire time, which again is odd. I'm not writing about his family. I'm writing about mom's side, but he was really like the patron ancestor of the writing of that book. So, you know, it's I have my family altar, he's on my family altar, but I also have a picture of my dad here in my office. It's in my line of sight because I really feel like he is the family member that kind of blesses and watches over my writing. Make sure I actually does it. I actually
Well,
do
I
it.
mean,
So
him being a Libra, it makes sense. So
he's a Libra, I'm a Gemini. We were two little air signs in the middle of a bunch of water and earth signs. So, you know.
yeah, I am literally, now that I think about it, I am literally the only Aries in my entire family.
Oh wow.
Like
Yeah.
like my mother, like in my extended family as well.
That's wild.
Yeah, it's a lot to bust through, believe me. uh, surrounded by like Geminis and Cancers and Virgos and Libras. And that was one thing, like I sat back one time and I actually like charted my extended families like in my head very quickly. And it was like, oh, well, this one's, and my cousin is the only Pisces, my younger cousin. So she was born like at the
Wow.
beginning of March. I was born at like the end of April, but there was another cousin that was also born in April, but she was a Taurus. And it was just like, wow, this is really, and there was really nobody until later grandchildren came that were really any Capricorns or Sagittariuses. Like everybody tilted towards the spring and summer months, that June, July, August,
Hmm.
October, September. So it was really interesting to just see even how you interact when you get together.
Yeah. One of the stories that, because I didn't understand, especially when I was younger, the inaccuracy of paperwork. So my grandmother celebrated her birthday April 3rd every year. But that's what her birth certificate said. So that's when she celebrated her. She was born June 3rd. She was born 2 days before I was in the month. I was born June 5th. And so we would celebrate her birthday in April, but then I would always insist that at my birthday we would she would get acknowledged, or we'd do a little mini celebration of Grams's birthday, because I thought it was so cool growing up that my grandmother and I were only 2 days apart in the month.
Right.
I was like, why? And she's like, because it says April on my birth certificate, so we just celebrated it in April.
Oh my
Okay.
gosh. Wow. Well,
It's
that's, I mean, and that's, it gets really interesting because I came into copies of paperwork of like my grandmother didn't have a birth certificate. We had her her baptismal
naturalization. Oh, yeah. Yeah,
baptismal
yeah.
certificate. I'm looking and I'm like, she don't have the same name. I was like, how did this happen? Like, and I was just like, and like apparently her dad went by two different names, her mom went by, and I'm like, oh my gosh, like how in the heck am I even going to like trace
It's
this?
like, no wonder I can't find them anywhere.
Right, right.
Yeah.
I was just
The,
like, I couldn't believe it. I was like, I'm looking and I'm like, was she adopted? Like it was just like it was so off
where
the
did
wall.
she come from?
Yeah.
Oh,
But
my.
yeah, that was like a big thing too back then that they like, and there's still things like that. Like Italian families were so big and they named everybody after the matriarch and the patriarch, and then all of a sudden they just gave the kids nicknames when they got everybody together.
Well,
So
look,
like their names that you know them as aren't really their names at birth.
I have two Uncle Joeys
Yeah,
in the same family, like
yeah,
same mom, two Uncle Joeys. One passed away young, so the next boy that was born became Joey, which I'm like, that
yes,
is morbid. That
yes.
is
That
what
was on
grandma,
my
great grandma Mary, what were you thinking?
Yeah,
Like,
that was on my grandfather's side. There were 11 and 8 lived, and on my grandmother's side there was like 21 or 23 and 11 lived.
wow.
So
Wow.
there was like a Joseph, and they passed, and multiple twin births, and both like they all passed from pneumonia. It went through the family and
Oh
she
my
lost a
God.
bunch of them. But there was a Joseph. I'm getting chills as I'm saying it. There was a Joseph, and then he passed, and then they named the next one born was a female, and they named her Josephine.
Oh my God. Oh my God.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
And we talk
different
about
world.
all the ancestral trauma that we carry. I mean,
Different world, man.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
My little dog is racing around on the back.
Yeah, but and that's the thing. It gets, and that's the stuff that I grew up hearing. Like you said, you tell your daughter and you talk to your daughter about it and stuff. But it's so vast that I don't even know if I could pass the knowledge on
Well, and
sometimes.
it's hard, and
Yeah,
it depends on, when you're interested. So when Selena was little, from the moment she was, you know, conscious, able to talk and think, and even beforehand, like she was playing with tarot cards before she could speak. Because they've been such an important part of my life growing up, and um, she has been infused in this stuff. So this is just, she's not really interested. She's 14 right now, and she's not really interested. And it's like, time to put it down on paper. And I say that to people who, you know, even if you don't want to write a book, if you have children, and if they're not interested in your family's history right now, put it down on paper. It doesn't have to be fancy, it doesn't have to be super detailed, but at some point in their life, they are likely to wonder something about their background, their roots. And, God forbid, if you're already gone, at least they'll have a document somewhere that will passes some of that information along, because too many times people lose that entirely. And then they're forced to, either just wonder, or if when it comes to esoteric or spiritual practices, just start building from the ground up, and finding what resonates with them, based on their heritage. But if you have anything, put it on paper.
Absolutely. I mean, and that's the thing. I really cherish the teachers and the professors, you know, as I was growing up, and even my kids now, like that they force you to go home and ask about your family
Yeah.
tree and make a family tree.
Yeah.
Because that was the only way I think we ever would have had an interest in doing it, and researching and asking our parents.
Yeah.
So I was definitely very grateful for them. And I mean, my son just started college, and that was literally his first assignment from his English teacher, that he had to get up, he had to research about his lineage and get up and, like, as far as like the origin story of how your family came to America, and he had to get up and speak for like 3 minutes about it. So it was more of like a presentation, and so it was like two things rolled in one. And he had to like call my mom. He asked me some stuff, but he was like, "Whoa, I didn't even know all this." I'm like, "Well, you never asked."
Yeah.
Like, it's
There's
always like, "Leave me alone, I'm playing a video game." Like, now you're asking,
well,
so now you're finding out.
I tell people that, when I announced to my brother, I was like, I'm getting book published. And he's like, really? He's like, on what? And I said, on all of the spiritual stuff, all the magical stuff that our family did. And he's like, is there enough to put in a book? Was his first question. And
Right.
it struck me, not only was how gendered the information was, because I got very little information from my grandfather,
Mm-hmm.
um, but also, how even two people growing up in the same household with the same family can have two very different upbringings, because I sought the information out. I wanted to know. I was super curious about what was going on. And he just didn't he had his other interests. And so he pursued those interests.
Well, but a lot of it too was like, it was very gender segregated when you had a get together.
Yes.
So
Yes.
so that's a
Yes.
whole nother level. The men went off and did their thing, and the women went to the kitchen, and it was a da, 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 da. So there was that too. But
I
it
I
was
just
but for me it was interesting because I was like the first grandchild on my mother's side of the family, and my mother was the oldest, so I actually got scooped up by my uncles. So
uh,
I was like
uh,
outside, like helping them fix a car, handing them wrenches. Like I was doing like boy stuff, like at a very young age. It was almost like I was their little sister, like not that
yeah,
I was their niece. And
that's sweet.
I really loved it. I really, really loved it because, even though I was growing up as the oldest and the first grandchild, it felt more like I had big brothers.
Yeah, that's nice. That
Yeah.
is nice.
Yeah, I went on dates with
Right.
them, and it was really weird.
Our last big family gathering, I burst into the kitchen at my mother's house, and my uncle Tony is sitting at the kitchen table talking to all the women, and all the dudes are out in the backyard and in the living room, and they're drinking and talking and smoking cigars. And I was like, what are you doing in here? And he's like, this is where all the food is, and this is where you learn everything.
Yeah.
He said that, he's like, you're not going to know what's going on with the family if you're out there. You got to be in the kitchen.
Yep.
But I was like, way to cross those gender lines, uncle.
Yep. Yeah. It's pretty cool. So, but yeah, I mean, and the interesting part is that, like, you know, they have their own history and their own memories because it was so segregated.
Yeah. Yeah. I wonder sometimes what I missed from my grandfather's mother, De La Rata, who I'm named after, to my grandfather himself, what I missed out on. Because there's that whole side, the paternal side on my mom's family, that um, I didn't really learn much from when it comes to spiritual or magical practices. And sometimes I wonder, like, you know, how it would have been different if I had had more access, if she was passed long before I was
Well,
born. But
see, that's the interesting part for on in my family. Most of what got handed down was my grandfather's mother, and she lived with my
interesting.
mother. So my grandmother's mother, I think she passed when my mother was like 2. So that's a lot. That's
Wow.
more hearsay and stories and stuff like that.
Hmm.
And then a lot of the stories of, you know, what was really going on and that grandmotherly connection came from my grandfather's mother on my mother's side. So yeah, so
Interesting.
that's a whole different dynamic. And you know, they had a lot of my grandfather's family in and out because she was in that house with them.
Gotcha.
So I saw a
So
lot more. Yeah, I saw a lot more of my great aunts and uncles on um my grandfather's side than I did on my. It was almost like when somebody came from my grandmother's side of the family, it was like a treat. It was like, because you very rarely saw them. And she had the bigger family.
we were down in Kentucky, and so, you know, we were isolated. The rest of the family was in New Jersey,
Hmm.
New Jersey, New York area. And so I still remember that when we would make the trek to New Jersey quite a bit, but we had one specific time my great aunt and uncle, great aunt Lucia and great uncle Michael, came to visit us in Louisville, and that was such a, it's so engraved in my mind because it was so weird to see them outside of their environment and in ours. um you know, but it, so it was an interesting upbringing. And in the book, North American Folk Magic for Llewellyn, I talk about that. Like, I feel this is spiritual association with West Orange, New Jersey, because that's where that was back home. That's where the family is. That was the center of the universe for my mother, and she managed somehow to ingrain that in me, even though I was born in
Yeah.
Kentucky. um, and that sense of place was really important to my mother. And I think it's very important to folk magic in general, is that your sense of place and where you come from and your physical surroundings. And I feel like I'm this weird transplant, even though I've never been transplanted. um, you know,
No, it
Louisville is
makes
home,
sense.
but New
Right.
Jersey is back home.
Right. And it makes sense because there were so many, and that's very interesting too, that when you talk about when when the Italians immigrated here, that they they sent them to regions, and you either went to Newark, you went to um well, that I know is Newark, but then a lot of people they sent to Boston area. There's a huge population in Connecticut, and surprisingly enough, regions in Canada. They actually
Mm-hmm.
sent
Mm-hmm.
a lot to Canada. And Rue's Kitchen Witchery, she's actually grew up in Canada.
I know.
Yeah.
That blew me away when I first got her book. I was like, oh,
Yeah.
Canadian American.
Yeah. And I went to Montreal and I had some badass Italian food in Montreal, let me tell you.
I
Like, it
when I lived in
was crazy.
Australia, Australian Americans are all over, or Australian Italians are all over the place, and the food is to die for. And they all
Yeah.
thought I pronounced things weird because they didn't have the same thing happen to the language in their country. So they kept correcting my Italian, and I kept getting pissed off in public. It was great. They
And
were
yeah,
really
I mean,
upset that I was dropping the
yeah,
vowels off the end of words all the time, and I'm like, that's how we do it
yeah,
in
yep, yep. It's so, yeah, I mean, and that's what's amazing because it is almost like being Italian American. And I actually explained that the other night. I was talking about it. It's almost like we created our own culture outside of Italy, because
America.
when you go to Italy, it's not the same. They do not
We
have
were
meatballs. They do not have fettuccine alfredo. They don't have that. Like, this is our own, and a lot of people can't wrap their heads around it when they go to Italy and they're like, this isn't what I expected. And
Yeah,
it's like, no, because
it's
you're different.
different. I
Yeah.
mean, how can after hundreds of years it be the same, a couple hundred years and not even that much, but like how can it be the same when you're completely removed from that environment? Like my grandmother never went back. She had
No,
relatives that she would write back and forth with occasionally, but my grandmother, my grandfather, they never went back,
no.
you know?
My grandparents never went. It was always like, yeah, we're gonna go, because it was their parents that came over.
Mm.
But yeah, nobody ever went back, and nobody went. And sadly enough, my mom never even went. Nobody in my family. I was the first one in my family to go back since my great grandparents on all sides.
Yeah, I have not been.
Yeah,
I have not been. I've done a lot of traveling, but I have not been to Italy. Not through lack of wanting, for not wanting to go, but just something always comes up or something, or next year or this or that. And my parents did it too. Every year it was next
yeah,
year or soon or next trip or we're
yeah,
gonna plan, but they never got there. And then my dad passed away, and now mom, I think if I scooped her up and put her on a plane, she may agree to go. But she's much more interested in jetting over to Hawaii to visit my uncle than going anywhere else. So
yeah. No, I am. It's, even though I'm an Italian American, when I go there, there is something in my soul that I want to belong. I don't want to leave. There's just something, that the history and just everything that's so ancient just sucks me in. Like, I love
mhm.
it. I
I
absolutely love it.
one day I'll get there. I have to
Yeah.
break the generational curse
Yeah.
of not going back.
Go with your daughter.
I will. I'll load up the whole family, throw the dogs in boarding,
Oh,
and we'll just go for a couple weeks
there
and
you go.
explore because there's so much to see. They're on so many
Yes.
different levels, on
Hmm.
cultural level, on historical, religious, spiritual. I don't know where I would start, really.
Yeah, it's a lot. It's very overwhelming. It's very overwhelming. I mean, I've been there probably on 4 different occasions now. And the interesting part is that for some reason we always gravitate back to Rome. And the first time I went to Rome, it made me itchy because I was just like, this is just like New York, but old and dirty. And like, I didn't like it. But like, the longer I stayed, the more I saw the beauty of it, you
Mm,
know, and to see ancient Roman history that has survived, and buildings that have survived, to like, and then having a modern building right next to it, it's just like the breadth of the history. It is just amazing to just see how they just
yeah,
coexist.
yeah, and that's something we don't get in this
No.
country because we're babies. Our
Yeah.
country's young.
Yeah. Or we pretty much destroyed it,
Yeah, but
for
we haven't.
progress,
Yeah.
which is just not cool. So, well, we're already at an hour.
That's amazing. Time
I
flies. Oh my
I
God.
know. I know. I love these kinds of chats that we can kind of, delve into all different things, all different aspects, all different ways that practitioners see things and view the world and their practice. I'd love for you to, in closing, tell everybody where we can find you, what you offer, because we never even really got into that. We talked about
Which is tore
family for
into
a
it.
whole hour. Yeah.
Oh, well, as because they're such a presence. So, everybody, my name is Dee Norman. You can find me at www.blackcandlecottage.com. I'm pretty much a Black Candle Cottage everywhere, on Instagram, on TikTok. I have a shop on Etsy. Um, I have written a book and a chapter. So I've written Burn a Black Candle, which is a book on Italian American magic, not Italian magic, on Italian American magic, and a chapter in Llewellyn's Complete Book of North American Folk Magic, which is also on Italian American magic. My next book is coming out in spring, and it's called The Golden Grimoire, which is a book on magic and wealth and finance magic, which I'm very excited about. Um, what else? And I do card readings, which all that information is on my website. And I have, like I said, an Etsy store where I sell some metaphysical supplies for Italian American practices. I've got candles, and I've got some interesting salts, and even some talisman stickers that I've made. So I think that's me in a nutshell.
Did you
And I
mention
forgot the
your
deck.
Lenormand decks?
No, it's also on Etsy. The Emblemata Lenormand deck. It's an oracle deck. It's traditional Lenormand, but it's based on art from 15th century emblem books. Is out there along with its companion book, Secret Symbols. So I've got to start carrying around a list or something, or put it on my wall because I forget. I think that's it. I think that's it.
That's
But
enough. I mean,
and another book is coming. Another two books are coming, but
I
those are
can't
in
wait.
process.
I'm
The
so
other
excited.
one's on grimoire magic and magical texts, and then the other one's a novel. So folk horror. I'm nervous about that one, but
You'll
thank you.
be fine.
You'll hear all about it
I
anyway.
know.
They'll be complaining about it in the future. But thank you so much for having me. This has
Thank
been
you so much for
absolutely
being part
lovely.
of it. Yeah, I mean, we're gonna have to have you back. I mean, there's no doubt about that. So
We'll have to talk about divination at some point.
yeah, I would love that. And I've been talking about for a while, like how I tried to like chase down. You know the story. I tried to chase down learning Vera Sibilla, and it was just the tarot deck showed up in the mail, and it was almost like the universe going, "Can you just try something a little easier at first?" So
I have
you know, I
found, oh, I won't even go into it because I know you're busy and you have to go, but I found this really interesting 32 card Italian divination deck. I don't know if I've talked to you about it. It's kind of
no.
like Lenormand. Yeah, it's, I got a vintage deck off eBay. It got shipped from Milan. Um,
Oh, you've got to send me a
I
link.
will send you a link. It's amazing.
Oh,
I love it.
oh,
I've been
all
using it
right.
quite a bit. I've been practicing with it. And I've meant
Awesome.
to bring it up in our weekly meetings and have not. So we have to talk about this at some point.
We're going to have to talk about it this
Okay.
week. All right, Dee, thank you so much. I love you, and we'll chat soon.
Love you
Mwah.
too. Talk to you
All right.
later.
Bye.